The Portfolio Composer, episode 185.
You're listening to the Portfolio Composer podcast with your host and coach, Garrett Hope, where he teaches you what it takes to master the business end of writing music through mindset, marketing, and business skills. Make sure to sign up for the newsletter at theportfoliocomposer.com for exclusive offers, business insights, and information not shared on the podcast. And now, for this episode of The Portfolio Composer.
I was focused on making a living as much as I wanted to make music. Like the difference between an amateur and a professional, you know? I mean, the amateur is the person who is in love with the idea of being an artist, but the professional is not simply an artist, they're an artist that needs to get paid for it.
This episode is sponsored by Dorko, the future of scoring. Dorko is the music scoring software of the 21st century, allowing you to write, publish, and play back music notation to the highest professional standards. Created by the world's foremost experts, Dorko marries art, engineering, and AI, resulting in scores of unparalleled balance, warmth, and beauty. Visit Dorko.com/TPC to download a fully functioning 30-day trial version of the software. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Portfolio Composer. I am your host, your coach, your teacher, Garrett Hope, and I am just full of gratitude and joy that you're listening to this. Thank you once again from the bottom of my heart for being a supporter of the podcast. One of the best things you can do to show some love to the podcast and to me is to tell other people you know about this podcast. You can just share links on social, you can word of mouth, you can give a review on iTunes. That's the best way to let other people know about this, because I truly believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. And so we are swimming in this ocean, and we don't need to think competitively anymore. We need to think collaboratively. And this is why we're sharing information, we're telling stories, and I'm doing everything I can to equip you as you build your business as a composer, as a creative individual. And I really do believe you're a business. I say that all the time, and you need to believe it too. What you're doing is a business, whether you're writing for media or you're writing for academic concert works. It's all the same thing in the end. Today's guest is a really exciting guest. He's a very active composer in film and television, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Peter Nashel. Welcome, Peter.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm looking forward to it. This is going to be a great conversation. Peter is a New York-based composer who works extensively in television and film. His latest television work includes Netflix's Marco Polo, as well as the Matt Damon and Ben Affleck-produced Incorporated for Sci-Fi. His recent film credits include Neon's I, Tonya, directed by Craig Gillespie and Tom McCarthy's Win-Win. He has worked with acclaimed director Alex Gibney on several documentaries, including Client 9. Peter, I spent some time on your IMDb page, and you can't look at this thing without being impressed. You have so many credits, and your earliest credit goes all the way back to the mid-90s.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So you've been doing this for 30 years almost.
For a very, very long time. Yes.
Oh, I could do math. That's 20 years, 25 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
It feels like a lifetime, though.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, it has been, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk to me a little bit here about that process. Were you a student when you got this first television credit?
You know what? I wasn't a student. I had just started to write professionally, as in getting paid for the work that you're creating. And a mutual friend of my fellow studio mate, a mutual friend of ours, was working on this show called The Head. And he came to us and said, I have this show, it's for MTV, it's kind of edgy, it's a little crazy, it needs a kooky score. And we took a look at it and we all laughed really hard and we thought it was really great and kind of goofball. I mean, honestly, I knew so little at that point because I was not one of these guys that had his sights set on music for the big screen from the beginning, not in the least. And so that first credit was really, you'll probably notice a pretty long gap after that before my next credit because...
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, actually.
Yeah, well, it's fair. I'll tell you, why don't I back up a little bit and just say, when I got out of school, I had spent my time in school focusing on instrumental music and particularly on saxophone. And then later in my college years, my school years, I got deeply, deeply into jazz and studying jazz. In fact, I took 1 year off from school and went and studied in Manhattan at the Manhattan School of Music, which was really a turning point for me. That was a really revelatory experience because I was able to be around kids that weren't at a liberal arts college, but instead they were training to go out into the world to be professionals. And that was the first kind of epiphany for me, is that, I could maybe go out and make a living as an instrumentalist. And hence I kind of went forward with that path, trying to get all my doublings, flute and clarinet and everything together to come back down to New York and play professionally. And when I started to do that, I was working pretty heavily. I worked did sessions, and I played in a bar blues band, which was a thriving kind of scene back in New York in those days. And for several years, I just simply played professionally until I started to realize it was actually a fellow saxophonist who said to me, you'd probably be really good at spinning the knobs on the boxes. And I didn't even really know what he was talking about, but it, piqued my curiosity. And what I discovered, it was kind of at a time when MIDI was really first being democratized. So you had, Performer and the early Macs and early synthesis. And I almost immediately became like I went OCD with all of that. And I went really deep into trying to understand and then to mimic that kind of music, that I was hearing, and just trying to understand sequencing and how that was working. And then by chance, I happened to do a session at a commercial production music studio. It was called Tom and Andy, run by these two guys, Tom and Andy, who were really interesting guys. It was very fortunate for me to kind of have my first experience with them because they were really unique. They were Princeton grads. They were running Next machines, if you can believe it. They were just getting into hard disk recording. They had what was at that time was a very advanced one called the Roland DM80. And I went over to their studio and I played on a session, and that was another real epiphany for me because I saw what they were doing and I understood. I musically, it really opened my eyes and my ears. Like they were doing purely almost like collage composition, which I just didn't know about, if I'm being perfectly honest. Like at the time, I'd never seen that. Hip hop, it was part of the language of hip hop, and the way that you kind of use samples of things and you take things out of context and then recontextualize them. That was all new to me. I was completely blown away. And so I sat and I talked with them after the session, and I told them that I had just kind of started to get into MIDI, and they said, we'd love to hear some of your music when you get a chance. And so a few months later, after just listening, watching TV and listening and working on stuff, dropped off a tape to the studio and got extremely positive feedback from them. And that was really, it was a turning point for me because it was also the first time that I got out of doing a $75 a night gig to a $150 wedding to a jazz gig that didn't pay anything to this. Instead, I got into a world of, okay, we have a telephone commercial we want you guys to write on. We have a Lexus commercial. We have this. And then and I say we because my studio partner at the time and we worked as a duo. And, it was really very eye-opening to us because within a few months, we were winning jobs and we were getting paid. And that was what allowed us to stop doing jobs like temping in law firms or doing all these kind of other crazy gigs just to keep the rent paid and just to keep enough, just to survive, basically. And I really liked that. It was more than I found it to be essential that I needed to be involved in something that, I could make a living doing. And I was very lucky to have stumbled across those guys in that instance and learned that craft. And for that was in the early 90s. And for about, I would say a decade, really worked extensively, not just with those guys. In fact, that was really only for a year and a half that I worked with Tom and Andy, but bounced around the New York community, got embedded in the New York community of commercial music, which we knew no one in it and we knew nothing really about it and just learned as we went. But because we were young and willing to take risks and were really getting deep into, what could be done with these types of small studios without, for instance, a Synclavier or a Fairlight, that was kind of it, that was the revelatory moment that you could sit at home with a few $1,000s worth of gear, not an unbelievably expensive piece of gear that only a professional studio would have. And the more that we created music in that zone, it was just, we were getting paid, we were winning work, and we were really happy.
I just want to go all the way back to clarify. You, as a young musician who's at university to hone your skills, you are aiming to be a performer, and you kind of fell into composition.
Absolutely. It's the funniest thing in the world. Like, it was almost like I had to quit playing the saxophone, like in a cold turkey moment. Like, I never looked back. Once I was still doing music for me, but no, I wasn't the kid who saw Star Wars and said, that's what I want to do, or the kid who saw Jaws and said, that's what I want to do. I didn't really grow up specifically on romantic classical music or classical music at all. It was around the house. But I really grew up as first a classical alto saxophone major who then parlayed into studying jazz. And jazz was really my window in musically. And I was very dead set on pursuing that. And when I came to New York, I kind of heard the level that people were playing. And while I knew I was good, I never considered myself, like when I would listen to other people play, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a much bigger swimming pool than where I came from.
Right.
I didn't see myself being able to make a living how I wanted to make a living. And I kind of felt like I was going to be living someone else's life, if that kind of makes sense. Like, I was conforming to what it meant to be an amazing doubler, to be able to work on Broadway, or an amazing soloist to get called for sessions that still had saxophone solos, for instance, back in the day. That type of thing.
Yeah.
And then I took a complete 180 when I came to New York. And it wasn't until I really did an ad that I became really much more interested in music for picture, which is the funniest thing, because a lot of people, I think, who do this, they've known forever. They were bit by the bug very early on, and that was not the case at all with me.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I just at this point have to ask a tangential question.
Yes.
Because as a composer who writes for media myself, I've invested in sample libraries and so on. And I almost never write for saxophones because I just can't find a good sounding saxophone library.
Right.
So how do you deal with that? I mean, you could probably just record your parts.
Depending upon the type of music that you're creating, generally speaking, not always. I mean, it depends on what you're working on, but there can come a point when you're writing or you're producing a piece of music where you just go, I'm just going to sketch this out. I'm going to write the melody out, or I'm going to write out the chord sequence. And then I'm going to sit with a musician who plays the instrument all day long and has for years and years and hone their craft. And I'm going to sit with them and say, hey, I want just downstrokes on the guitars to give it a little bit of an edgier feel, and can we maybe slightly detune that a little bit? And I wouldn't want to sit in front of a sampler to try to make that happen, to trick the ear. It's just so much easier to give a call, whether you're in New York or LA or frankly anywhere, to musicians that you know and have worked with and love and feel comfortable with, and also frankly feel comfortable kind of, sometimes making an ass of yourself. Like, hey, I'm not 100% sure how that's going to sound, but could you try to do something like this? And then you have that creative collaborative process back and forth with an instrumentals. But typically, you're right. I mean, it's kind of like aleatoric phrasing in orchestras. Like, a lot of the sample libraries will have this press middle C and you get a cluster, or press middle C and you get portamento, an opposite.
Yep. But
really, how do you write freely in using that language? I don't think you do that with samples.
Yeah, it's really hard.
It's It's really, really hard. And the people that do that, my hat goes off to them, because I know that they're on a higher level of kind of programming expertise than I'll ever be. So I generally tend to like not sit and try to program stuff that I know would just like go down so much more smoothly if I called up a musician.
That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. And now back to the regular scheduled programming.
Yeah.
So in that gap between that TV show, which was called The Head, and when you really started consistently getting film work, you basically were doing licensing for commercials.
I was doing exactly what you talked about at the head of the podcast, which was I was focused on making a living as much as I wanted to make music. Like the difference between an amateur and a professional, you know? I mean, the amateur is the person who like is in love with the idea of being an artist, but the professional is not simply an artist. They're an artist that needs to get paid for it. And you know, how was I going to live in an expensive city like New York or frankly LA? How was I going to provide for myself? And that long, you know, we did The Head, and honestly, it was like a goof at the time. Like we never thought like, oh, this is going to continue on to lots of other gigs. And for the most part, it didn't. Every once in a while, we would bump across somebody who'd be doing a documentary film or whatever. But at the time, my studio partner and I, we had such a good thing going. We were really getting paid, and we felt a great deal of pride in that we were writing music that other people were willing to pay money to use, and it allowed us to buy gear and to build up our studios, and it gave us time to just work on our own music and work with artists and do other things that we would have felt, I think, differently about doing had we been scrambling the whole time just to make ends meet.
Right.
But between The Head and when steady film work happened, honestly, it was like the heyday of commercial music writing for us. We were literally turning down phone calls. We would get called with more projects than we could even do. You know, and this maybe happened over the course of 3 or 4 years of just staying at it and getting our name out into the community. And we also made the switch, which was it's like an epic switch to go from the person who gets called from the other music production company to write the music for the spot to being the music production company that gets the call from the advertising agency directly from the place. And once that happened for us and we saw actually how much, you know, really the budgets were, we could not imagine doing anything else. And frankly, like when, you know, and this was at the heyday, mind you, of a lot of independent film in New York City. And it wasn't really even on our radar. I mean, we would see something that we liked and we'd talk about it, but it wasn't like this career pursuit at that point. And when that switched for me was when a good friend of mine from college, who I'd kept in touch with, he lived out on the West Coast, and turns out I was going to be visiting San Francisco where he lived, and he said, oh, the funny thing is I'm actually going to be on a film shoot. And we got to talking about it, and he said, oh, you should come by the film shoot. I said, sure, whatever. He said, would you be interested in taking a look at the film and scoring it? I was like, honestly, not really, because I have a good thing going here, and there's never going to be a budget to do it the right way. There's always like some nonsense with independent film, and there's no money and blah, blah, blah. And he said, okay, fine. And I ended up going out to San Francisco, and then I drove to Tahoe. And the minute that I walked on the set, I thought, oh, like this is a movie. I saw all the trucks and the crew, and I met the directors, and then there's Tilda Swinton, and I was blown away. And I immediately rethought, yes, I do want to do this. And that was really how my first feature came about. It was an independent film. It was a very, very difficult experience for me because I was learning as I went. I had no idea technically really what I was doing. When they'd say, do you need a music editor? I didn't even know what a music editor did or who they were, what part. There were so many parts of that process it was all new to me. Right. And I made it through that process, not easily. And we mixed it actually out at Fantasy Studios in Berkeley. And I have to say that at the end of the job, hearing that score play back in a theater really gave me goosebumps, and it made me feel really proud, and it made me think, oh, I can do this. Like, that sounds fantastic. And then the film went to Sundance, and Fox Searchlight picked it up. And then it was just like a domino effect of how things kind of built up from that. And it was really based off of that first film that I did, The Deep End. And that was really a changing point for me.
Wow, that's a great story. And you know, it really is an amazing feeling, not just to hear your music performed live, but to be in a theater watching a fully produced production film, and you're like, that's my music.
Oh, there's nothing. I mean, I actually wasn't prepared for it, because in my mind, I was like, I've done Super Bowl commercials. I've done this, I've done that. Like, I was none too impressed. And even when I was looking at cuts of the film, I was still just looking at them on my TV and writing music in a studio. And then, you know, I recorded it in a nice studio in Manhattan, but it was still just on relatively small monitors. It was that first time of seeing the film projected and hearing it all come together that was the aha moment for me. That was really a turning point for me. It just blew my mind.
I'm sure it did. I have to go back again, because you keep saying so many interesting things.
Okay, yeah.
One of the things you said that you and your composing partner, studio partner, you said, I'm assuming this is the Duotone audio.
That's exactly correct. Jack Livesey is a guy that I grew up with, have known since the 6th grade. We played in talent shows together. We played bar bands together. We played in a band after school together. And it was really with Jack that I said, man, there's got to be something better than playing club dates on Long Island. Like, we've got to look into this. And it was really with him that we developed really this commercial music production studio. And Duotone came about in the mid-90s. We started together, we split apart for a few years and worked independently of each other, which I think is sometimes common in creative collaborative environments, because sometimes, you know, like we used to joke, it doesn't take two guys to play G minor. And I think we were experiencing a little of that and wanted space, and we took some space away from each other. And then I built a studio in Tribeca, downtown in Manhattan, and he was one of the first calls I made. I said, I need someone to help run the studio because it's bigger than just me and the music that I'm working on. And we got back together, and that was really the commercial music production side of my life, because Duotone, you know, it's the company that I built. And for many years, it was a very small company. It was me and Jack and a very small team of people that we just worked on spots that would come in. And, you know, we were blessed in that we never had a shortage of phone calls and of work. You know, everybody goes through kind of peaks and valleys, but at the end of the year, we always kind of just, you know, toasted each other and said, man, this is amazing that we're able to do this.
I'm going to interrupt you again there.
Yeah.
Because you kind of referenced it a little bit here, but you said it a few minutes ago too, that you and Jack were surprised. I think that was the term you used. You were surprised to learn that you could actually make money doing this.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I want to know, what were some of the most surprising things? Obviously, you're realizing that you can make this your vocation, but there's the whole business side of this. You were trained as a performer, and you'd spend hours on your saxophone, and you knew how to get gigs, but now you were learning the business. What were some of those highlights, those learning moments for you?
Well, I think first, it was when I did the date at Tom and Andy. It was for a Reebok commercial. I remember it vividly. And people at the time looked down on this approach creatively, by the way. But when I met them, you know, I walked in the studio and was all set to read any chart that was put in front of me and play anything that they wanted me to play and be whoever they wanted me to be. And they kind of smiled, and they're kind of slightly like, you know, they're like, oh no, we want, like, do you know who Albert Eiler is? And do you know who Yusef Lateef is? And I'd be like, yeah, but why? And they were like, that's kind of what we want, like multiphonics and weird runs and honks and this. And they wanted the feel of out of control. And they were using the saxophone as that tool in a very unconventional way. And I did that session. And I remember leaving that session and calling up Jack and just being like, you're not going to even believe what just happened. And it was amazing. And I got paid for the session. And then we developed that relationship with them. And when we started getting paid, you know, for us, at the time, we could not believe how much money they were paying us to do these demos and when we would win these finals on these commercials. That was one gigantic turning point, was just being hired within another company and their business that existed. Then what happened to me is when Jack and I broke apart, I got a phone call one night from a mutual friend. She said, listen, there's a job going on over at Tom and Andy that they don't have time to do. Would you be interested in talking with the people from the agency? And I said, sure, why not? And so I get a phone call from this guy at this agency, and I remember early on he asked me if I knew who Portishead was, and I said, yeah, dummy, because that was the name of their album, Dummy. And we laughed, and we were immediately friends. And he said, look, come on up. We want to show you what we're working on at the agency. I said, sure. And so I went up and I met with them, and they were doing a big ad campaign in Europe. And I wrote a bunch of music, which initially everybody loved, and it was really great. And they were pitching a client, by the way. I'd never even been involved in that process. I didn't even understand really what it was, but they were kind of showing their client, this is what we would do for you. I wrote a piece of music. They did their thing. And then it turns out that they won the business, but they had bad news for me because they weren't going to hire me. They were going to hire somebody else who was in Europe. And I said, okay, because I just didn't know. But then they gave me 2 other commercials to work on in the meantime. And I did these 2 commercials, and that was the first time that I had ever been paid directly from an agency. And then I got really interested in commercial music for advertising because I thought, wow, I could do 3 of these in a year, and that would be more money than I ever thought I was going to make in a year, because I was a performing saxophone player. I didn't anticipate riches. That's not why I went into doing that. I just loved making the music and loved playing the instrument. So for me, that was a gigantic moment, because that really turned on my business head, which had previously not been on. And the end of that story is that they actually ultimately did end up coming back to me for the much larger campaign that they were working on in Europe. And that was the job, and that was the agency that made me completely independent. And I would do work for them for several years. I literally just sat in a studio and wrote nonstop music for this agency and really made a great living doing it. And that was huge for me. That kind of set the stage for me to be able to then even entertain doing any of this other stuff.
And this work is typically work for hire, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So there's a higher upfront fee because they're buying your publishing rights and everything else too.
That is exactly correct. Now, it doesn't mean that you give up your writer's share,
right?
But, if I'm being perfectly honest, I'm not sure that I was totally knowledgeable about all of that initially. And I'm not sure that the agency was. And in advertising at that time, I don't think a lot of clients and or agencies were smart enough, maybe outside of Procter & Gamble, to collect any royalties. Like, they didn't know that was an income stream, because that wasn't the business that they were in. They were like, when we run a Pampers ad, we're not collecting royalties. That's got nothing to do with us. That has changed quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, I think Disney taught that lesson.
Exactly. That's exactly correct. I didn't mind the work for hire because I was getting paid these fees up front that were, they were so much more money than I ever thought imaginable. And it was allowing me to do the things I wanted to do, which was buy more gear for my studio, make more music, feel more freedom, like not to be able to live in the city and not like scrounge around, but to just have a little bit of breathing space. So I was fine with that. I wasn't imagining that the theme that I wrote for a brand in Europe was going to be a quote unquote important piece of music that wasn't worth selling.
Right.
I never occurred to me.
You kind of walked away from the commercial writing when you started getting after the deep end. So we're talking more than 15 years ago, but you had amassed a huge body of sync. It's a sync library, essentially. Is that still generating revenue for you all these years later?
Well, let me go back and say I never gave up the commercial music writing aspect of things. And in fact, to this day, Duotone is still mightily involved in the commercial music enterprise. Like, we are in all, whether it's licensing or creating original pieces of music, or licensing something from our library, or licensing a famous artist, or we are still focused in that business because that business is good to us, and there would be no reason to give that up, to forsake that. Now, my personal journey was, after The Deep End, I actually didn't think I was ever going to work on another film after The Deep End. It wasn't like I immediately, a career just popped out of the blue and it was all became clear to me that I was meant to be some, a film and television composer. Not at all. In fact, I kind of crawled back to the studio and probably worked on like a L'Oreal commercial the following week, And in fact, I thought that the training that I was receiving, or that I was creating for myself doing commercial music, was what made me good for feature and for television work. Because you work quickly, you have to be able to listen to instruction from people who aren't necessarily music people, but they're creative people. And you have to be able to kind of express your ideas in a way that they're going to understand them, i.e. get very, very good in your studio, as in the studio is your instrument now. It's not really the piano or the saxophone or the synthesizer. It's the studio that becomes your instrument. And so really, after The Deep End, we never gave up, or I should say I never gave up on writing commercially. Through the years, I've become more selective. I tend to work with people who I've worked with in the past, and I tend not to kind of go through the gladiator process that is really prevalent in commercial music writing, where demo number 4 or demo number 11 or piece number 6 is what the client's gravitating towards. And I like to work, obviously everybody would, but I like to work more with people who are like, we're going to do a version of this with you. Let's get to work. As opposed to this, we listened to 500 pieces of music and we ended up with you. Yeah, it was never like a case open, case closed thing with me. I mean, even today, like, part of my day is spent in the commercial music world.
So part of the philosophy of the portfolio composer is that as contemporary composers, we do multiple things to generate revenue, to pay the bills.
Yes.
I mean, it'd be nice if we could do one thing and pay all our bills, as if you had a traditional job. But we're not in a traditional field. We're not doing traditional work. So this is still generating revenue for you, and you're doing everything else. And the nice thing about building these assets, because they are assets, is that the more you do, the more writing you have, the more assets you can draw from. It's not just, you're not adding to income, it creates an exponential curve to what can happen.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know that, for instance, with Duotone, through the years, we have written so much music. We have a vast, vast library. Truth be told, it's really the last maybe 5 to 7 years of music that's been written, that's been done in our more or less current studio setups, so that those sessions you can call back up much more easily. You don't have to rebuild them. And if you want to repurpose them, like, they're all decent, great pieces of music that can sometimes be repurposed or remodified or whatever it might be, as opposed to starting from scratch every single time you go to, work on a job. Film and television isn't quite the same. Film and television, it's a different approach, and all that tends to be just original, ground up. Like, you get into it, it's a longer, deeper dive musically than the commercial music world. But yeah, I mean, what I think is key to understand is that it's taken years and years and years for me to create some sort of steady income from my PRO, from BMI, or from whistling and singing and doing stuff on commercials for Screen Actors Guild, for SAG, or playing on stuff with the AFM, or getting the secondary film musician fund checks paid to you. Like, it really starts to come from different areas, and it accumulates, as opposed to, oh, I'm just getting paid such huge fees to write, music for something that I don't need to worry about anything else. A lot of times, sometimes the things that generate a lot of money for you, you weren't paid a great, huge fee up front, but then it just somehow got worked into the bloodstream and got used an awful lot, or got repurposed a lot. And you just see a nice check from, Fox or from Disney or from wherever with the publishing end of things. And so that's that's fantastic. But
Yeah.
I think it's much more realistic to think of them as all kind of like the branches leading to the root, as opposed to like you don't need the branches anymore.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it. It's still a portfolio style of income.
Yes.
And I like your point that it takes time to build this up.
It takes a huge amount of time. Yes.
Yeah. You had said when you started contracting directly with the marketing companies to do these the commercial work, it turned on your business brain. And that was the phrase you used. And I love that. What did you do at that point to shortcut your learning process? Because you basically had to go to 0 to 60 as a business owner.
Yeah, I think I started to recognize that it's not all about the music. That yes, a composer and a creator of music, but I'm part of something a little bit bigger. I'm not writing concert music. I'm not writing my band's latest EP or LP, or this is a pop song. This is particularly music created in the world of music for picture. And so I started to pay attention to who's hiring me and how do those budgets break down. And wow, that's interesting. The first time that they called us, we got paid X. And the second time they called us, we got paid X minus 20% as a favor. But then the third time we paid them, or we worked with them, they paid us X. And then the fourth time they paid us X plus a little extra to make up for that. And I started to realize, oh, you can't, like a lot of younger people, and maybe even myself included at times, would think, I'm never going to let anyone rip me off. I'm never going to let them use my music without getting paid. I'm never going to. And then you start realizing like you can lose a few battles, but because you're trying to win the war, because you're really trying to think of this overall. Like you want to make friends and you want people to think, when they think I need music, I had a great experience working with this person and this person gets it. They can listen to me. That was a whole other part, both creatively and business-wise for me, that, up until that point, I was pretty, I don't know if the right word is solipsistic or whatever it is, but I was very me-centric. It was all about me and my saxophone or me and the tracks that I was kicking. Whereas at the end of the day, really what I started to learn very quickly was, no, you're working within a group of people that are trying to accomplish something else. You need to be a team player. And that extends into the business realm as well, that, you're trying to build relationships with people who are going to go on to bigger and better things. And if they've had a great experience with you, they're going to then think of you. And a lot of relationships that you can look at, whether it's in film, very high level relationships, whether it's Steven Spielberg and John Williams, or Carter Burwell and the Coen brothers, or, Howard Shore and David Cronenberg, whatever, those go on, where you see certain composers have worked with certain directors, and it's not a payday on every film. Sometimes it's a creative endeavor that then leads to a payday. And you have to start thinking more in those terms than in just each individual instance. And am I getting taken advantage of, or am I getting paid the most? And that was a steep curve for me to learn, for sure.
I bet. When the dominoes started to fall in terms of building the big picture work, the TV and film, what steps did you take to build those relationships? Because based on other interviews and personal experience, you can't just sit back and let it happen. You have to be proactive in creating opportunities and networks. So what actions did you take?
Well, I think after the deep end, and, the deep end was really fantastic for me because it created interest from music agents. It created interest from, and I didn't even know that such people existed prior to meeting with him, for music management, music manager. I should say that I should qualify that by saying I didn't realize that existed in the film composer world. And I was fortunate enough, and it was a little bit of luck, to be honest with you, that I met some really good people early on, and I listened to their advice, and I would fly out to LA and take meetings with people in music departments and try to get my name around. And it's really a combination of that, and then try to socialize. You can't do it from your bedroom. I think even now with social media and with how, short a distance it seems between each and every one of us, because you can just instant message or email or text or whatever it might be, there really nothing replaces actually sitting down and meeting people and getting a coffee, or, you know, having them hear your story, or having them hear what you're really into or what you'd like. That's very difficult to do via social media. Whereas in the olden days, like, maybe you wouldn't get as many of those done, or you wouldn't have quite the reach, but you maybe had a little bit more depth with those interactions. And so I worked hard, you know, through the directors who I worked with on the deep end, to get introduced to other directors that were New York based. And that led to more work there, and to meet some people who worked at independent film companies in and around New York. And then I'd go out to LA and get introductions to some people out there. And, you know, I'll be perfectly frank, a lot of that led to nothing initially. And it really took another little fortuitous chance that I wrote a score, and then somebody heard a piece of music, and then it got a nice little write-up here. And the next thing I know, I'm now working on this project. So for me, I kind of think that the younger guys today, or the younger people today, have a little bit of a leg up, particularly if they know from the beginning that this is the business that they want to be in. There's a little bit more of like framework to follow in terms of how to do that. Back when I was doing it, I was naive about it. And so I did what felt natural to me. You know, I became naturally friendly with some people that were in the film business. And then that was really kind of my trajectory. I didn't all of a sudden create the Peter Nashel brand. In fact, I think one of the problems that I've suffered from is because I was always kind of tethered to and deeply invested in Duotone as my music production company, that it wasn't entirely, I didn't feel the necessity to create Peter Nashel, the brand composer. And I think looking back, that probably would have been smarter for me to have done earlier on, because I see that that's important, that people, you know, want to know about you and who you are and what you do and what your musical proclivities are and how you like to collaborate. And they want that. You know, back then it was, well, I have an agent and I have an IMDb page, and, you know, that was basically what I thought was all I needed to do. So maybe my trajectory wasn't quite as fast as it could have been if I had worked a little more on brand me instead of just kind of bouncing about.
Perhaps. But you shouldn't discount the networking and relationship building that you did do. It's really hard to quantify an ROI on relationships.
Exactly.
But it is obviously paid off.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think that, you know, at the top of our conversation here, when you kind of reminded me a little bit to my chagrin as to how long I've been at it.
Sorry about that.
No, but you want to know what? I think that that's a good thing for other composers to hear, is that, you know, sometimes it's a natural thing. You look out and you see, oh my gosh, this person that I knew from college, or this person that I knew, or this guy wrote that score and it's so huge and he's only 28. And, you know, that stuff happens in the same way that certain composers don't maybe come into their own until the later part of their life. They don't find their voice as a composer. I think actually one thing that I should mention is that one of the biggest transitions for me of not just simply turning composing into a business, but understanding the difference between writing commercially and writing for film and TV was that when I was writing commercially, it was a positive character trait to be a jack of all trades, to be able to kick out a salsa track or a hip-hop track or an indie rock track or whatever it might be, that to be that kind of ninja guy and be able to sit in the studio and just, boom, there it is. Oh my gosh, that sounds just like, you know, the current band of the day doing that song, but it's not them. Thank you very much. Versus what I think should really be, and for the people that are really successful at it, is their MO when you get into writing for film and TV, or frankly, obviously for concert work, which is to focus more on your artistic voice. And that's a huge leap of faith and a scary one, because you go, well, gee, is anyone going to like my music? Are they going to still want to pay me money for my music as opposed to my, for lack of a better word, my sound-alike for this ad? You know, and how's that going to work out? And I think that ultimately for the people that are most successful in the film and the TV world, it's because they have a voice as a composer. And that's an incredible feat to accomplish, is to stay true to that, like how you hear things and what your influences are. And that, well, maybe my influences shouldn't be all the composers of the day. I should stop listening to the guy who did the score to this movie that I love or this love, thinking that I'm going to be that composer. No, maybe you should listen to music that, really, interests you and influences you in a creative way that you come up with something original. And ultimately, when you do that, and people start to hear that, then they start to go to you specifically for that. And that's a rarefied place to get to, which I think I'm in that zone. I don't know that I'm always in that zone, but that's really more the headspace that I'm in these days, is to focus on my voice as a composer as it relates to film and TV.
That's a fine distinction, isn't it? Like finding your voice and then being the jack of all trades musically.
Absolutely. And it's not easy. It's really not an easy thing, And I wouldn't have done it any other way, because I think I learned a lot of valuable lessons by just sitting in the studio and having to listen really intensely to, why does this music work? Why does this salsa track work? Or why does this flamenco track? What's the difference between flamenco and salsa? And why? There's the clave pattern here. And, it's like going back to school. And I think that that's actually it's a very, very smart thing to do, to understand like the principles as to how music is created. But then to a certain degree, it's a little bit like jazz. You kind of have to just forget about that and be like, yeah, but who do I want to be? Because when I hear Thomas Newman, I know immediately that's Thomas Newman. Or I hear Philip Glass, I know immediately that's Philip Glass. Or if I hear a lot of people, I go, oh my gosh, that just sounds so much like that composer. There's Cliff Martinez, or there's Clint Mansell, or these are people who are, there's Trent Reznor. Like, I know that sound, and they own that sound because they believed in it and they perfected it and they worked really hard at it.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's the hard thing, though. And I guess what would be your advice for a composer who's considering either a career shift or moving into media? Should they, if film is the ambition, should they focus on the voice? Or should they become so versed in so many styles that they can do any project that comes their way?
I firmly believe that, both of those things should happen simultaneously. I think it's a little bit contradictory, but I think if you want to have a successful career in film, yes, you need to focus on a voice as a composer. You need for people to think of you as the composer who does X, Y, or Z. This is what you get when you call Alexandre Desplat, and but now that doesn't mean that all his scores sound the same, but there's a voice in there that continually comes out. I think that the reason that you're able to traverse different projects is because you have versatility, which you can get from the commercial writing. And so in that regard, I think it's both. I do think, though, at the end of the day, the most important thing is to focus on a voice. And then, frankly, it's a little bit of a roll of the dice. I think you would maybe even know more than me because you've spoken to more composers, but there's generally a relationship at the core of it where there is a director or a producer that brought people in and kind of gave them the room to do their thing. And then people said, hey, they look at it and they listen to it and they go, hey, that works and that sounds great. And you're the person that did that. And it's as one producer friend of mine once so eloquently said to me, it's a little bit like the FU card. It's like you've gone to that next level and people can kind of respect you and think of you as the person who does X. I think if you spend your time always mimicking someone else's style, it'll be that much more terrifying to kind of express your own voice, and it might not be successful at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people wrestle with that. They do. Because any successful guy that you speak with, they've clearly done lots of different types of scores, but at the same time, the ones that generally stand out are people that really have a super strong voice musically.
I love it. Well said. This episode is sponsored by Dorko, the future of scoring. And we want to feature real Dorko users so you can know that real composers out in the world today are using Dorko to make their careers happen.
My name is Reginald Unterzehr. I am a composer, conductor, voice teacher musician of a variety of sorts. It does absolutely everything I need. Plus, every time a new feature is released, it does it with depth and clarity that I have never seen in any programs to date. Right now, I think my favorite, I'm just finally figuring out the idea of flows. I'm deep into a multi-movement choral orchestral soloist project. And so there are certain aspects of that I had not explored at all and didn't really need. And now that I see how they work, it's going to be a tremendous help when I get into the rehearsal and distribution of scores phase and revisions phase. It just makes the way that flows are set up makes it a single document that works for all the different movements of it, and I'm loving that. The number one benefit is the fact that I believe this program has legs, that there's going to be updates that come out regularly. The team that runs it is a reliable, solid team. The people who own it are responsible and have a commitment to the musical community. This was my big problem with the platform that I left. It was like, this platform has been abandoned, and I do not want to spend another cent on it. I definitely recommend Dorko. My number one thing is that it actually presents a path forward as my work continues. I am 62 years old. Learning a new program is daunting. I really like the way that the scores look. They just seem very natural. The spacings work so much better. The way that choral scores work now, the way that it works with lyrics, the way that it works with layouts. I went back to I was with the choir doing a piece that I had put together in another program 8-10 years ago. And they were asking me all kinds of questions about, what is this note and what is that? Is that a tie? Is that a slur? Is that a this thing? And I was looking back at it and I was going, oh, yeah, they really fixed that problem, didn't they? Because I don't get those questions with Dorko. People look at the notes and they play the notes or sing the notes and it makes sense. They don't have to figure out what the program meant by it. I run into problems in rehearsals oftentimes when tracking the eye across the page confuses them rhythmically. And I have not had that problem at all with Dorko. Again, it seems to be it gets out of the way of the interface between composers' intentions and musicians' reading. Rather than introducing barriers, it removes barriers, and I like that a lot.
The kind folks at Dorko have set up a special webpage so you can go and download a free 30-day trial copy of Dorko. So go and do that. have been using the program, and I'm absolutely in love with it. Go to dorko.com/TPC. We were discussing writing commercially versus film and the benefit of creating a voice as well as learning how to do everything really well. And your answer was essentially we need to do it all, but you really need to do your voice at the same time. And during that conversation, I was reminded of an interview I did with Kevin Kelly. Are you familiar with Kevin Kelly?
I'm not actually, no.
Kevin Kelly is not a composer, but he's a futurist and a technology guy. He's one of the founding editors of Wired magazine.
Oh my gosh.
This is a guy who is a deep thinker about the future and how technology will play in our lives. And he wrote this great book called The Inevitable 2 years ago, and I got the chance to interview him. And he also has this blog post that's very relevant to what we do as composers called the 1,000 True Fans Theory.
Wow.
But one of the things that he points out here is that in the future, what's going to make the difference, what's going to help you stand out from the noise of the crowd is having a unique voice,
yes,
which is basically your brand, right?
Yep.
And customization. If you're fungible, if you're exchangeable, how can you differentiate from anyone else who can do what you can do?
That's exactly right.
So that's why you need to have a voice, right?
Yeah, I think there's no question about it. I mean, I think that the most important thing that a composer can do over time, well, there are a couple things, you know. I'll tell you something that just kind of popped into my mind. A lot of that work as it relates to film isn't necessarily you off on your own, quote unquote, digging deep and creating your own voice. A lot of that is, and one of the things that I've learned, I would say much, much more in the last 5 to 7 years of doing this, is that you're a storyteller. You're one of the filmmakers. You happen to be doing music. That's what you're bringing to it, the way that a set designer or a production designer or a costumer or the cinematographer or the editor will bring their specific trade to bear within that collaborative and creative process. But at the end of the day, you're really just part of the filmmaking team. And it took me so long to figure that out and to realize that, like, the most important thing you can do as a member of that creative team is do what's best for the project and then translate that into music. And I think that some of the composers that we think of as having the strongest voices, their own brand, it's come about because they've worked with directors or they have a relationship with people that ultimately it's informing them and it's helping. Like, we think of John Williams in a particular way because of these opportunities, these collaborative opportunities that he had, early on in his film world. And then he cemented him as being that guy who does this particular thing. Now, if you really listen carefully to John Williams' work, it's actually all over the place. Like, the guy has range like nobody has range.
Yeah.
And it's a jazz score, it's an orchestral score, it's this. There's so many aspects to him as a composer, but what I think the man on the street would say when you said John Williams, or you sang Star Wars, or you sang Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Close Encounters, or Jaws, or something, they'd be like, oh, right, like that's John Williams. When in fact it's much more than that. But I think that voice becomes more developed the longer you are in a relationship with other filmmakers who you think like and who you create music like.
I love it. Beautifully said. Can we take a moment to just talk about one of your more recent films?
Yeah, of course.
I, Tonya.
Yes.
I love the idea of this film, and the trailer totally intrigues me. I haven't seen it yet, but I remember this happening, right?
Yeah.
I was alive. What was that like, scoring this film? Because you were watching the news while this whole thing unfolded too.
Absolutely. And I mean, honestly, I walked away from the whole thing kind of just shaking my head because, like so many things, the story that came to me, that got filtered down to me, painted Tonya Harding in one particular light, and it was judge and jury all in one. Like, I just walked away thinking that I understood everything that had happened. And I think what's so interesting about the film is that it takes, to me, three very, very important issues that are happening right now in our society. It takes gender, it takes class, and it addresses the nature of truth. And they do that so well without being preachy, with it somehow being a part. And I think that's the format. That's the kind of slightly dark humor, the almost mockumentary feel of the film as it goes down, I think allows you to revisit that time period that you thought you knew so well when it happened and make you see it in a new light. And that's why I think the film is really resonating because, back when it happened, I don't think the first thing that crossed people's minds was, oh, she's getting a real short end of the stick because she's a female athlete who it has gigantic thighs. And they used to make fun of the way she looked and the way that she skated. And you think, gee, nobody would do that today. Like, you look at the size of Lindsey Vohn's thighs or look at the size of, Venus Williams' thighs. Like, these are professional athletes at the elite athletes. And this is what that body looks like. And back then, I don't think people were really ready to understand that. That went against the grain of the diva-like feminine quality of what a figure skater should be like. And I think that it also was happening at that time, which I didn't really realize, was there was such a culture clash between the kind of, she even says, like, the redneck upbringing, like her upbringing in rural Washington, or Oregon rather, and where other figure skaters came from, and Nancy Kerrigan embodied that blue blood Massachusetts, but I never really saw it as a conflict, as a class conflict like that. And then certainly what was so interesting was to kind of hear these same events as kind of told through the eyes of Jeff Gillooly and Tonya Harding. And it's very eye-opening because I think that you somehow start to question the nature of the story that had been told to you. And you see, like anything, it's like the Rashomon effect. You see, like anything, well, there's probably a couple of different sides to this story. And that's what I think makes the film so, that's why I think it resonates beyond like a cheap entertainment. But I think the entertaining value of it, the filmmaking technique and the way that it hits you as an audience allows for you to not feel like you're being preached at or taught a lesson or told what is the right way to think about this. Instead, it allows you to just kind of sit back and realize, wow, I thought I knew all about this. But at the end of the day, maybe not. Maybe not.
Wow. I'm looking forward to watching it. And in the trailer, it appears as if Margot Robbie brought her A game. Like she is just on top of it.
She is incredible. Allison Janney was incredible. You know, the first conversation that I had with Craig Gillespie, the director, after I had screened the film was I said, I mean, you have a knockout. I never knew the meaning of screening a film. And literally I stopped halfway through and said, oh, she's going to get nominated for an Academy Award. Like I've never had that experience. And when I watched this film, it immediately was apparent to me. I was like, these are unbelievable performances. And he just did such an incredible, incredible job of capturing those performances and then creating that feel that I think it really gets under people's skins. Like it's really impactful. Yeah. It's really fantastic.
Well, I'm really thankful for your time, but I'm wondering here, before we move into the lightning round, if there was anything you wanted to talk about or wanted me to ask you, but I failed to do.
No, not really. You know, for me, it's an interesting conversation for us to have because as we kind of mentioned, I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier off the record, we were just kind of saying most people just want to know about your current project or what your approach was or creatively what ended up working for the team or how do you approach writing a score or things like that. And they don't talk about the business end of it. It's almost in some circles, it's almost like you shouldn't be talking about how do you create a business out of this and how do you create a life out of it. You should only be the artist. And then there are other people that you encounter that are really only interested in the business end of things. And I think it was a delight for me to be able to have a conversation and feel free to just say, you know what, it's kind of both things. You have to piece together a living so that you can get the next project. And how do you get the next project? You get the next project by doing a great job on the one that you're working on currently. And all of those things, you know, kind of make up the whole. It's not just one thing or the other.
I love it. Well said. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back for the lightning round.
Welcome to the lightning round.
You ready?
Yep.
Peter, if you could go back in time to the 20-year-old young man who was practicing saxophone and looking forward to a long performing career, what advice would you give yourself?
I think the advice that I'd give myself is it's always good to be goal-oriented, but you should be open to what goals you actually go after to accomplish. That sometimes personality that I have, you become kind of monomaniacally fixated on being the best at one particular element. And that was me as a young man. I was certain that I wanted to do X, Y, and Z. Now, I think the zeal and the approach of that was the right thing, and the energy and the openness was the right thing. But I think to tell myself at 20, I know you think you want to be this person, but you should be really open to other opportunities that come through the door. It's a very difficult thing sometimes to know what are going to be life-changing opportunities and what aren't going to be. What are just like a little encounter and what are things that are going to like literally change the course of your life. And I think I would probably give myself that advice. Be more open to that. And also, frankly, have a little more confidence in myself that the things that I'm feeling or the way that I'm feeling about something, have confidence in myself. And, you know, I've developed that over years of reading and watching and listening. But it's a difficult thing to hold on to that and to feel confident.
Yeah, I like it. That's good advice. What is a personal habit of yours that you feel leads to your success?
One, I think, is that I'm always seeking out music that I don't necessarily create on my own, but I find constantly little tidbits of a harmonic phrase or an instrumental kind of arrangement or something, and it comes from the weirdest places, and to just be open to that, to not feel, again, not so fixated on I'm going to create late 19th century romantic classical music for the big screen. Instead be like, well, what are some of the things that really moved you? Like, you were really moved by the score that Explosions in the Sky did for Friday Night Lights, and you were really moved by the electronic scores that you were hearing, pursue that.
Great.
And for me, that has led, I think that's been a big part of my success, is I've just been open-minded about that. And so, I tend to listen and grab ideas from wherever they come.
Oh, awesome. You're a woodwind player, and I love how you describe that you play the studio.
Yeah.
But what is an instrument that you have always wanted to learn to play, and why?
The guitar. And it's because I feel like 45 or 50% of the music that I'm working on could be guitar centric. And I'm always approaching it from a keyboardist mentality. and I know that every guitar player I ever work with kind of rolls his eyes, a little bit in his head, because like, well, that sounds good on the keyboard, but that's not how the instrument works. So I would probably say the guitar.
Oh, I love it. That's one of my instruments. So I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Now, this next question is often the most challenging for people to answer. And let me frame it for you. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys tells a story about driving around LA in about 1962 when Phil Spector's Be My Baby, performed by the Ronettes, comes on. And he almost crashes his car. He says he has to pull over because his mind is exploding by what he's hearing. And it literally changes the course of his career. So I'm looking for those pieces that made time stop for you, that might have altered your path, that took your breath away. And these don't have to be concert music, classical music. It can be anything. Can you name one or two?
Oh, sure. Well, initially, before I was even sure that I wanted to pursue music, I think there were a series of jazz records that I listened to that really, they kind of had that impact on me. Listening to John Coltrane and listening to Miles Davis and listening even earlier on. There isn't a specific piece of music that blew my mind, but when I really started to do the deep dive into jazz, that altered my life first and foremost. That made me want to pursue music as opposed to not pursue music. And once I got into writing music for film, oddly enough, there were two Danny Elfman scores. Yeah. There was one to a movie called The Simple Plan, and there was one to the movie Good Will Hunting. And I saw both of them. I don't remember exactly the order and when they occurred, but I just remember being so unbelievably moved at the power of those scores in those films. And that was literally, those were moments that like stopped for me, because I was like, oh, now I understand the impact of the score. It wasn't like a Mancini scored A Touch of Evil, or like Alfred Newman score. It wasn't one of these like unbelievably like everybody references that score. I happen to think both of those scores are superb in the extreme, yes. But they were touchstone moments for me. Like I heard them and I just thought, oh my gosh, like that is unbelievable, the effect that score is having on that film. Those films are not half of what they would have otherwise been if they didn't have that score.
Oh, I agree. I feel the same way about the Good Will Hunting score, and it doesn't sound like any other Elfman score.
Exactly. It's really remarkable, like the freeness of that writing and the way that the colors were used and the instrumentation, everything about it. I was just absolutely blown away. I will say I also had a similar reaction when I listened to Alexandre Desplat's score to the movie Birth. And that was a really big, and he did another score to a film called The Beat That My Heart Skipped. And those two scores had a similar kind of, just like a lightning rod went off in me. And I just was like, oh my gosh, this is so powerful. Like, why is this music so powerful? Why am I having this reaction?
Mm-hmm. I do want to nail you down on the John Coltrane, though. Even if you can't name a piece, is there a go-to album for you?
Is there a go-to Coltrane album? Maybe Soul Train. I mean, I'm not as much of a fan of some of the later work when it got freer and kind of got more out there. I tended to kind of what I could kind of comprehend of his playing before it got into sheets of sounds and all sorts of advanced Slaninsky, patterns for improvisation. Before it went
Right.
there, I think I was just a fan of this kind of Philly hard bop, just jazz master playing, whether it's with Curtis Fuller or whether it's, on the Miles Davis. Honestly, on Kind of Blue, you listen to that and and frankly, Cannonball playing that stuff. I had a similar. There's so many of those albums where I would listen to the solos nonstop. I just couldn't even believe what I was listening to. The language was so advanced, But I would say it was a little bit more in the hard bop zone before things kind of took a turn for the Freedom Train.
Got it. Is there a book you could recommend that you think we should all read?
That's an interesting question. This is a funny book. I was a fan, even though it didn't get maybe as much noteworthiness as some of his other books, but I was a real fan of Jonathan Franzen's book Freedom, and it kind of explores the notion of what freedom is and what freedom means. And I think that applies to music and to art in general, as to sometimes having restrictions around what you're doing is actually freeing creatively to have to work within the confines of a particular environment, as opposed to you can do anything you want in any way that you want. Sometimes that's a little prison unto itself. It's not actually as free as people think of it as. And it explores notions of that. It's a piece of fiction, so it's not really about music at all. But I just remember it made me think long and hard for a long time after I read it about notions of freedom and kind of what that means.
Oh, wow.
I also actually had an unbelievably strong reaction to a book by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is really about kind of how the West and colonialism evolved. And I think that's a very interesting thing, that it reflects in how we perceive culture and how we perceive beauty, and how, there are a lot of very interesting themes in that book as well.
Yeah, that book has come across my radar before. I really need to read it.
It's fascinating.
So, Peter, where can we find you on the internet, and how can we get a hold of you?
On the internet, I have unfortunately, a very rudimentary website, peternashel.com, which has really nothing on it except my contact information and my IMDb page, my contact information for my agent. But you could certainly send an email to info@duotoneaudio.com, and if you address something to me, I'll end up getting it. That's really, unfortunately, all that I have as far as my own personal branding and my own website goes. But you can certainly find me there and see what I've worked on, and maybe what I'm about to work on, and things like that.
Well, I've gotten a great deal out of this conversation. As I told you earlier, I've grown, and I'm inspired, and I'm very thankful for your time and your insights and for sharing this with me. And I hope that we can inspire many other composers too.
I really hope so too. And I thoroughly enjoyed it and felt like it was a refreshing take on the composer interview. I grant you that, in spades.
Well, thank you. This episode of The Portfolio Composer has been supported by Dorko, the new professional music notation and composition software from Steinberg. Dorko has been designed from the ground up to be a flexible and powerful tool. Whether you're a composer or arranger, a teacher or student, working in music engraving and publishing, or working in producing music for media such as film, TV, and games. Compared to other scoring programs, Dorko is fast, fluid, and efficient. Designed for comfortable use on a laptop on the go, but seamlessly scaling up to working on multiple large displays in the studio. It has a beautiful, modern, and uncluttered user interface that allows you to focus on your music. Dorko also embraces the traditions of the finest printed music and produces pages of such balance and proportion by default, you'll be amazed. You can bring music into Dorko from your existing software using Music XML or MIDI, and you can try Dorko out completely free of charge for 30 days by downloading a trial version from dorko.com/TPC. Try it today and experience the future of scoring for yourself.